Hello everyone, Ethys here, Great Gubal Library, Law Tour as promised, let's get into it. Now, a lot of people have taken to calling this place the Great Gubal Library, overlooking the fact that nobody seems to understand what on earth a Gubal is. So naturally I went looking and came up with a few different explanations. Firstly, Gub, spelt G-U-B-B-E in Swedish, is a kind of casual referent for an old man, so we could think of this library as Gubal, as in of old men, where, as I'm sure the case is with many libraries, all the old people hang out. The alternative comes from Russian gubernia, I think it's gubernia, which was the term for an imperial province from the Latin gubern, or to govern. So a gubernal library would either be the major provincial library, or either the library of the governors or the library which itself governs. Gubal, gubernal, I'll let you decide whether you think they're close enough to conflate, but I think the latter idea, that this reservoir of knowledge is itself considered the governing power of Garlean, ties in pretty perfectly with our current understanding of Garlean ideology. Anyway, we had the Mega Neura there. I think we're coming up to some more here, which was kind of a giant dragonfly which lived a few 100 million years ago, had a wingspan of something ridiculous. It was 65 centimeters or 26 inches. I think the most common theory for the existence of these kind of giant insects was the atmosphere during these prehistoric periods had a high level of oxygen, so a larger body was sustainable for insects. Anyway, if I remember, I'll show you a fossil here because those things are pretty cool. As for the sentient inkhorns, well, there's not really much to be said about those. But we see on the floor here the first of a really common motif throughout the dungeon, and even on the monolith in Garlean proper, of a nautilus shell, or technically a logarithmic spiral, which is basically a self-similar curve which is seen as so important and fascinating in geometry because the angle at which the spiral meets the radius remains consistent ad infinitum. I'm not much of a mathematician, so I don't know how clear that explanation is. But you can take my word for it, it's a big deal. It was discovered by Descartes, who was very important to both Renaissance mathematics and metaphysics. And it's a shape replicated throughout nature, such as shells, of course, also the horns of a ram, the nerves of the cornea, the approach of predatory birds like hawks and falcons to their prey, or of a moth to a light, the arms of spiral galaxies, and the bands of cyclones and hurricanes. There's thousands of examples. So how exactly does this relate to Garlean? Well, when Cartesian tradition, mathematics, and formal logic are seen as the true and most valuable way to describe any phenomena, anything in nature, and the logarithmic spiral is one of those things that demonstrates how everything in the world might be made knowable without having to leave the ivory tower, which is of course what the Garleans are all about. Now that was our first piece of lore on Garlean Hierarchy Volume 1. It describes the way that the rise of the Empire in 1522 of the Sixth Astral Era led to a general social restructuring. So we have all of the royal and military titles, which I'm not going to read here, but I'll try to copy all of these notes into the description. Basically, it's all based on Latin, as we knew, and one interesting point is that there were two different titles for members of the royal family, one both for those eligible to the throne and those who are ineligible to the throne. More inkhorns, and I don't know what the falcons are doing in here other than that they are known to approach their prey, as I said, in this same logarithmic spiral. So perhaps the Garleans kept and tamed them as some sort of inspiring or affirming signal. So coming up to Marilith, this is another enemy from Final Fantasy XI. I don't think that it directly references anything, but my guess would be that it's a combination of the word monolith and marrow, perhaps as in bone marrow, since the Marilith has a far more skeletal appearance than its golem cousins. I don't really know. If anyone has an idea on that, I'd love to hear it. We've got in this room as well some sentient tomes. That's pretty self-explanatory. I tried reading what was on the cover of these, but at the resolution we get, I don't think it's discernible. I might be wrong about that. Again, if anyone has managed to look at like a high-res model of one of these and can read the cover, I'd love to hear it. We've got Garlean Hierarchy Volume 2 there. That stuff is honestly pretty fascinating, but there's not much to be said about it. Again, it will be in the notes below. Now we have the Hall of Magics and the Demon Book. This is one of my favorite bosses leveling up in Heavensward. Obviously it's the same kind of deal as the Demon Wall, where the Charlanes have summoned some kind of voidsent into a book to either protect its contents or the library wing in general, or maybe both. As for what it says, I've personally had a dig at this a few times, and there's an interesting thread on the official forums which I'll put in the description. The common theories there are that it's basically concerning a volume number regarding ether, Eorzea, and demons. It's not in English or any other discernible language, but there are little bits of familiar Eorzean words and Latin suffixes. So first the titles, we have Pentetalothus Theologicad Ilchaeos. It's a real mouthful, sorry. And then the sort of chapter subtitle is Teteth Cthulaniaco. So Pentetalothus, Penta is 5, Loth is the Middle English word for loath. Theologicad is most likely regarding the study of ether. Ilchaeos probably refers to Eorzea in some way. Teteth Cthulianaco brings to mind the Greek chthonic or subterranean, describing the underworld or realm of demons. So we might have something like 5 loathsome ethereal applications of Eorzea, with the chapter subtitle From the Void. Something like that, I think, is what we're working with here. I don't think anyone has made any kind of sense of the rest of the text, but like I say, it seems to be written in bits of Charlan, Dravanian, Asian, or something similarly foreign to us. If there are any linguists listening, look, give me a shout. I'll copy the text out for you, and you can see if you can make some sense of it if you like. Okay, that's one down. Spandule. Now this is a fun one and a bit of an esoteric reference, so bear with me. Roald Dahl, as we may or may not know, served in the British Royal Air Force during the Second World War, and his very first children's book was about gremlins, whom the Air Force pilots would often sarcastically refer to as the cause of malfunctioning or damaged aircraft. So Roald Dahl took the image literally and wrote about a race of gremlins that would sabotage British aircraft after the Air Force leveled their forest home to build a runway or a factory or something like that. So eventually, of course, as with you'd expect a children's book written in 1943, the British eventually managed to convince the Gremlins to join them in the fight against the Nazis, and the Gremlins were retrained as mechanical engineers. And to bring it back around, the Spandules were a particular nasty kind of gremlin in this story that would chew on hailstones and exhale over your wings or cockpit and make them freeze over. Nasty little bastards. Anyway, the story was commissioned by Walt Disney. It was intended to evolve into an animated film, but it never got off the ground, even though the book was a pretty big success. The Spine Dusters are adorable, similar to Matoya's frogs. They were obviously created as maintenance and janitors for the library, and they kind of remind me of the librarian from Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, who was a wizard accidentally transformed into an orangutan, decided that he would rather not turn back. He quite liked having not having to wear pants and was already quite partial to bananas, and Was a really fun and interesting character. Rest in peace, Terry Pratchett. You are sorely missed, and look, I've gone and made myself sad now. Page 64, I've been trying to think of something auspicious about the number 64. So it's the smallest number with 7 divisors, and 7 is a number we see everywhere. It's the atomic number for gadolinium, the number of squares on a chessboard, the maximum stack in Minecraft, the number of characters in Braille, an important number in computing, in the title of some of my favorite Nintendo games, the number of sexual positions in the Kama Sutra. I think the best lead we have is probably that 64 is the number of demons enumerated in the Dictionary Infernal, the predecessor of the Lesser Key of Solomon, and one of the primary influences for demonology in Final Fantasy and really all fantasy in general. It also may be noteworthy that this page 64 is the same page as the Demon Book is open to, and actually every page of every open book we see in this library. Essences and permutations. So this describes to us how elements might be converted along the wheel and how elemental weaknesses traditionally work. Once again, I'll be sure to copy the text into the description for those that are interested. Now, someone is going to point out, if I don't, that page 64 was an enemy in Final Fantasy V, along with page 32, 128, and I think 256 was the strongest. I have a feeling page 32 might appear somewhere in this dungeon as well, but I can tell you right now that the open page, it's the same damn page 64 through and through. And we have in this room over the horizon. This one actually got me pretty excited. So we've heard a couple of passing references to the New World, and correctly assumed it to be some reference to the Americas from the perspective of early British colonialism. Here we find that was actually Melwood Blufusween whom was responsible for the discovery of this western continent, and that what she was doing during the events of 1.0 up until she returned to Limsa Lominsa as admiral. This distant land is also the native home of the Mamalja, and some people have already speculated that it might in fact be Vana'diel, which I personally hope not, but that's a thing which I suppose may or may not happen. So pseudo-sprites are obviously distinct from natural sprites, and these are presumably the product of some Charlene elemental ethereal experiments. It's quite interesting. I can only wonder at this point how they might work. And here we're in the natural history room with a giant nautilus shell on the wall and giant fossils with more naturally occurring logarithmic spirals, which we've already talked about in length, but I guess this serves to really consolidate my theory. On the right seems to be a tree trunk, and on the left, I wasn't so sure about that, perhaps a limb of an ancient sea serpent of the same ilk as Thaleos pericos, maybe some kind of fossilized dragon dick. I don't know, question of the day, what the fuck is that thing? Byblos, clearly Minotaur. I did talk at length about the Minotaur and the Fractal Continuum, so check that out if you haven't already. There is, of course, here once again, page 64, and the floor is covered in overlapping logarithmic spirals and what appears to be mappings of constellations. So this room is actually the Astrology and Astromancy camera. So I think it's fair to assume that this is indeed a map of constellations, and maybe it actually reflects the night sky over Charlene at some particular point in time. The Egyptians used to build this kind of stuff into their architecture, so I feel like this is probably something similar. Now, Byblos is a city in Lebanon, and after it is named the Byblos syllabary, a pseudo-hieroglyphic script which has never been deciphered, and of which only 10 different inscriptions have been found containing a total of 1,046 characters, some of which look like modified Egyptian hieroglyphs and date around 2,000 years BC. I should actually, I'll see if I can find a picture of the syllabary, and I'll put that up, because that's quite interesting here. So I feel like naming this guy Byblos is, in a way, kind of taunting us for being unable to decipher even this one paltry page we've been shown at least a dozen times by now. And as if to nail it home, he is going to summon again and again our favorite page. we talked about with the Demon Book, how the title of this page seems to refer to voidsent summoning in Eorzea. It might be that the repetition of this one page is actually canon, and not just lazy design, that this book is actually a kind of Necronomicon that has been copied over and over again by the Charlans, that they might have an endless supply of guardians for the library, or that this book can summon really any kind of voidsent known to the Charlans, maybe even that only this page is required and each book just has it copied over and over again. Who knows? I'd love to hear theories about that. Actually, when we defeat this guy, he refers to something about his master's seal being broken, so I think it's more likely that the book doesn't actually summon the voidsent, but tethers it to the world after it's been summoned, and to the will of the summoner, so it's like the Charlan equivalent of a pentagram of blood and candlesticks, I suppose. And there's the only hat and glasses combo. Who doesn't want that? So we're coming up to the Tome Shifter Imp. We've already seen in one text about Melweb a reference to an event that didn't happen until after the Charlan Exodus, and we're about to see another. So how did these books get in here? And given the sightseeing log tells us that most of the books were cleared out during the Exodus, why are there still so many books in here? Let's just take a look at this name, Tome Shifter Imp. My theory is that these little bastards are tasked with collecting books, texts, notes, journals, anything they can find across the realm to be brought here, indexed, and stored. That would explain why there's a note concerning Melweb, and also why we're about to see a note about the transformation of Lady Amandine, which only occurred a year or two ago, well after the Exodus. We're coming into the School of Fantastics. This is where the really crazy theoretical shit goes on, and a Scatine calling more voidsent, as you guessed, from page 64. Scatine is the definite plural for skates from the Old Norse skatar, which is a kind of rayfish, or in a roundabout way is also Swedish for magpie, which I guess this thing kind of resembles, and is typified as a kind of scavenger and collector, so it seems appropriate to this dungeon. A Vidoriga is, like my aunt, a French gargoyle. And Bibliocast, well, it's cast from a book. What do you want? Sometimes you just have to put mobs in a library and name them Book Mob or Words Monster or Demon Book. Okay, just let me have that one. The next we're fighting coming up, you see all the books chained to the bookshelf there. That's interesting. It's kind of a Harry Potter thing, isn't it? Anyway, we've got the Logos here. So Logos literally means word in Greek, but the reference here is to the modes of persuasion in classical rhetoric as introduced by Aristotle. So ethos is the appeal to authority, the ability to make oneself seem an expert in the field of discussion or appealing to others' established expertise. Pathos is the emotional appeal, and Logos finally is the logical appeal, the facts, statistics, the cold truth. And the Dullahan, of course, is much better named as Logos than it would be as Ethos or Pathos. Another question for the comment section: if you were to rename an existing mob in the game to Ethos, as in an appeal to emotion, what would it be and why? And don't say Gaelic Cat, that one is, that's just lazy. And not just something cute either. There's mobs that might tug at your heartstrings for particular reasons. I mean, think of the Tonberries and their whole background as Nimians. So I'd probably choose a Tonberry or maybe a baby Mericidian. Speed Reader, there's another one like the Vidoriga Bibliocast. I mean, come on, it's an eyeball monster in a library. Although, maybe these guys work as something like grad students, and they just spend their whole lives poring over tedious piles of text so that they can succinctly summarize them for their supervisor, who just leans back sipping martinis watching all these scrubs do his research for him. No? Does that sound familiar to anyone? That's probably how I would work if I was a Charlan. Anyway, this here is about Amandine being used as a vessel for a voidsent succubus, which should make us feel a bit more sympathetic towards her. And what is that? Look, wow, a shameless self-promoting annotation to my video on Lady Amandine and her real-life inspiration, Countess Bartari Erzabet. Seriously though, that one was one of my favorite videos I've done so far. You should check it out if you haven't already. The Umbral Zone is a lot of fun. I'm trying to find something else in the game I can frame for that series at the moment. If you have any requests for it, any ideas, I would of course love to hear. These are all old friends here we've already talked about, so I'm going to let myself tunnel and take a breath. Try to ignore Poe and Cersei calling for me there. Now, one of the interesting little things about this dungeon is the weapon drops. They're all Nimian, or Belladine, or pre-imperial Garlean stuff, which is a really nice. I mean, look there, Royal Nimian. So that's a really neat touch, I find. I love seeing all of those weapon designs from these ancient civilizations, and it makes sense that the Charlans would be collecting that kind of stuff. The final journal entry there is, of course, some obligatory fan service, tentacle porn. Someone has made a terrible mistake and has managed to write about it moments before being savagely sodomized. Outstanding. Can I just say before we get into this that I really love this boss music. Definitely one of my favorite tracks in Final Fantasy XIV to date. So the Rhapsodies, Quadrangle, and the ever-living Bibliotaph. So a rhapsody is a single movement. In poetry, it is an epic that can be recited in a single performance. And in music, it is typically an emotional composition of an extended movement, sometimes a kind of theme and variation sort of thing. So basically the Charlans are keeping the poetry and sheet music hidden in the deepest, darkest, uncharted dungeon basement of their library, which is exactly where Socrates would keep it, alongside the hanged corpses of the musicians and poets. Plato and Socrates were not overly fond of poetry. It is a dishonest and dangerous thing of far too much pathos and not enough logos in their eyes. So along the same lines, Matoya thought her journals would be quite safe here from the prying eyes of her fellow academics. Now, a bibliotaph is someone who collects and hoards books. If we're going to follow the Socratic thread on which the Charlan civilization is largely based as a whole, we might think of this guy as a warden of all the art and music and poetry, which is far too dangerous and influential to let float free among the people, but at the same time as pieces of literature far too precious and sacred to physically burn or destroy. It's also notable that the text on the face of the bibliotaph reads truth, T-R-U-E-T-H-E, which refers to the suppression of poetry and rhetoric in Plato's eyes as an important function in discerning truth in speech and in the world. It is geometry, which is the art of truth, and not these pretty opiates and muddied waters. Finally, there's the Bibliomancer, which I was hoping we wouldn't have to see, but I know one certain book mage who was probably quite pleased to meet this guy, and that's really all I've got for this dungeon. As always, thanks for watching. Comment below with any questions, thoughts, or requests. Press the things that make the stats look good. Tell your friends, tell your kids, call your mum, and tell her to follow Ethys on Twitter. Feel free to write out the rest of this fight if you're interested to see how a pretty scattered monk plays at 59. Otherwise, I'm going to finish this and get it uploaded. Stop trying to stall my outro for the rest of the boss fight, and I hope you enjoy it.